What's up guys, back with another educational video, and in this week we're going to talk about a new study on skipping breakfast. Now I know a lot of people, especially in the intermittent fasting realm, they love to skip breakfast. Again, we've talked about fasting kind of ad nauseum. In this particular study, they compared isocaloric breakfast skipping group to a 3 meals per day group. The reason this is important is because they equated calories and macros. So in a lot of these studies where they have people skip a meal, they don't compensate by having them eat at other meals. And so it's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. In this study, they had one group eat 3 meals a day. The other group skipped their breakfast, ate bigger lunches and dinners. What did they measure? They looked at energy expenditure. So basically how many calories each group was burning per day. And they found that there was no difference between groups. This is not surprising because this is very much in line with what we've seen from other research. What was interesting is that they also found that slight, what they called irregularities or abnormal blood glucose fluctuations in the group that was doing the breakfast skipping. So they had higher blood glucose later in the day. Now that being said, I don't think that that's something to worry about with skipping breakfast. In fact, I'm actually not surprised by this at all because they're having to eat bigger lunch and dinner meals. So if you skip breakfast, but you're going to keep calories equated, you have to eat more later in the day. They also looked at fat oxidation. I've talked about this kind of in theory before, but this was really the first study that kind of bore this out. And that is, if you skip breakfast, a lot of people say, well, skip breakfast or eat low carb at breakfast, because if you do that, you're going to burn way more fat throughout the day. That's true. If you don't eat carbs or you don't eat breakfast, you're going to burn way more fat. But if you're keeping calories the same, that means you have to eat more later in the day. So this study, they looked at fat oxidation early in the day versus later in the day. Early in the day, the group skipping breakfast had greater rates of fat oxidation than the groups having breakfast. However, later in the day, the group who skipped breakfast had much lower rates of fat oxidations than the group that had breakfast. Why? Because they had to compensate to keep their calories even between groups to overeat later in the day, or not overeat, but eat more later in the day. The overall net effect on fat oxidation was nil. There was no difference in 24-hour fat oxidation. Now, some people have said, well, that's why you should just not eat carbs at all, because your fat oxidation rates will be higher. Well, if you care about fat oxidation, yes. But fat oxidation is not the same thing as fat loss. The amount of fat you actually lose, the amount of body fat you lose, is the balance between the amount of fat you burn versus the amount of fat you store in adipose. Carbohydrate is not really stored as fat in fat tissue. In fact, when they look at overfeeding studies, only about 1 to 2% of the fat that ends up in adipose, your actual fat tissue, comes from carbohydrate. What carbohydrate does do is it inhibits fat oxidation. So if you eat a lot of carbs, you're not burning a lot of fat, but you're also not storing a lot of fat. So this is why when you look at calorie equated, protein equated, high carb, low fat versus low carb, high fat, you don't see differences in actual fat loss, because in the high carb, low fat diets, you have lower rates of fat oxidation because carbohydrates are high. But you also have low rates of fat storage because dietary fat is low, and that's typically what is stored. In low carb, high fat groups, or in low carb, high fat dieters, you're going to have high rates of fat oxidation because that is the substrate you're providing, and you don't have much carbohydrate to inhibit fat oxidation. However, because you're feeding so much dietary fat, you're also going to have more fat storage in adipose. Again, the net loss or gain of actual body fat is going to depend on your fat balance across the adipocytes, i.e. fat cells, which is going to be, again, amount of fat stored minus the amount of fat burned. So fat oxidation is actually not a really great measure of how much fat you lose. The amount of fat you lose is going to depend on your total daily energy expenditure versus your total daily energy intake, regardless of how many carbohydrate versus fat you eat. That being said, if you enjoy skipping breakfast, if you're somebody who's not hungry in the morning, if you find skipping breakfast allows you to eat bigger meals later in the day and be more satiated, that is totally fine and a perfectly reasonable reason to do that. If you find that low carb is more satiating for you, another perfectly reasonable reason to do that. However, it's not magic. And this is borne out by also long-term studies, even months and months. They show very similar outcomes. There was one other study where they looked at breakfast skipping versus breakfast skipping versus dinner skipping, and found that if you skipped breakfast versus skipping dinner, that it might be a little bit worse in terms of inflammatory response and blood glucose. But I wasn't really convinced by that data, and certainly that is not more important than just being able to adhere to the diet. So if you're somebody who finds that I'm not really hungry at night, perhaps time-restricted feeding at night would be a way for you to create more of a calorie deficit. By contrast, if you're somebody who's not hungry in the morning but finds you're hungrier later in the day, then perhaps time-restricted feeding in the morning would be better. But if you're somebody who just likes to fucking eat and just have normal meals throughout the day, you can do that too. Any one of those ways you can lose fat on. What is going to work for you is what allows you to create a calorie deficit and adhere to it best. All right, guys, that's it for this week. If you want more information about this stuff, I talk about this in depth in my book, Fat Loss Forever. We go through, what I just talked about was covered in depth through like 3 or 4 chapters. All right, so we go into really fine detail, but we also give you practical recommendations of what to do in order to create the best fat loss diet for you as an individual and your metabolism. So make sure you click the links in the description if you want to get that. Subscribe to the stuff, like the video, and buy our shit.